Welcome to Briar Haus Writes. I'm Becky Parker. Today it is my honor to be able to have acclaimed author and poet with us today. She is the writer in residence for Cincinnati. She's been the poet laureate in Cincinnati from 2016 to 18, author of at least 9 poetry collections, one of which won the Weatherford Prize for Appalachian Poetry. And in 2023, her book, Heartbreak Tree, won the Poetry Society of Virginia North American Book Awards. So congratulations on all of that, and
Thank you
welcome to
so
our
much.
program.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I'm honored.
Pauletta, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, I grew up in southeastern Kentucky, which is in the Appalachian region of this country, to a family who had been there for very, very many generations. I still feel very connected to the region, both as a writer and as a family member and as a friend. But I've lived in Cincinnati since 1979. I came here to go to graduate school as a 19-year-old. Actually, I was an overachiever for sure.
Wow.
But then I went to graduate school in Montessori education, which was my first career, and just stayed. I mean, Cincinnati is an area where a number of communities and you know are made up of people who are from the Appalachian region, many of whom have been here much longer. Many families have been here much longer than I have. And so I've found many connections both to my home community, as well as made new friends and stayed ultimately. But I grew up in Breathitt County, Kentucky, primarily in southeastern Kentucky, and began writing as a young girl, in that community. My dad, I don't come from a family of writers, but I come from a family of readers. My dad, if he had a choice between spending money on food or spending money on books, it would definitely be books, unless my mother was there saying, "Okay, Charles, you have a family." So I grew up with books, and I grew up as with books as a way of entering into lives other than my own, and also understanding more about my life. So it was somewhat natural, I think, when I came to, a time in my life, and, in sort of puberty, pre-puberty, where everything seemed kind of all in a uproar, both inside and outside of me, that I turned to writing as a way to make sense of all of that.
And what led you to primarily writing poetry?
I think a big part of that, I believe, was that I grew up in the 1970s, when singer-songwriters were the primary, pop music. And so I grew up with Joni Mitchell and Janis Ian and, Joan Baez and Carly Simon and, James Taylor and, and all of those folks. So I think it was really music that brought me into poetry. I mean, poetry was not in some ways, in terms of reading for pleasure, it's not even now my primary field of reading, but it was my way of writing, and it continues to be. I mean, I write prose as well, primarily, memoir and creative nonfiction, but I mostly read fiction. So I guess I go across all the genres as reader or writer.
Well, do you ever face any challenges when you're writing? And if so, how do you overcome them?
I think that my main challenge is when I'm not writing, and by that, as a writer, once I'm writing, I'm able to find some way into words, especially when I don't necessarily put requirements on myself to be writing anything that is of interest to anyone but me. I can use writing as I can use journaling and fast writing, and other ways of a sort of process, using writing as processing, and end up someplace different than where I began, almost all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean that those pieces of writing will ever see the light of day, or even that I'll ever see them again, because my handwriting is so terrible from all this many years of writing in journals. Um, so it's really more for me. It's not. I don't experience writer's block when I'm writing, but I may experience, something you might think of as writer's block when I'm trying to work on a particular poem or a particular essay, or to find my way into a spacious state of mind where I can, create something that perhaps will see the light of day, and don't let myself go there, or I'm prevented from going there by external factors. But once I'm writing, I'm good, as long as I don't put particular expectations on myself.
And that makes really good sense because sometimes, you know, writing is such a solitary experience and you don't want it to be a gruesome experience for yourself. You want it to be one where you can just set your own pace and go as the ideas come to you. And speaking of that, would you read some of your work for us today, Pauletta?
Sure. I would be happy to do that. And I think what I'd like to do is to read a couple of poems from previous books, since you mentioned Heartbreak Tree, which came out in 2023, and also my book that Will There Also Be Singing, that's out more recently. And then if there's time, move into my current project and maybe talk a little bit about that project before I read from it, if that's okay.
Yes, sounds good.
Okay, great. So you mentioned Heartbreak Tree, which was the book in 2023, which won the Virginia Poetry Society's award. And this book really does focus on my life as a woman and my early life as a young woman living in Appalachia. And I talk about it as kind of at the intersection of gender and place, because I set out in these poems to explore what it means to be a woman growing up in a particular place. And in my case, it's Appalachia. And so there's a lot of family poems woven throughout, and girlhood poems woven throughout. And so I'll read a couple of those poems. This one is called Dirt. What people in town remember about my family's home was the dirt in the fenced front yard where no grass could stay grown, worn down by the feet of the kids Mom kept in the daycare where I worked too the summer I was 15 in my shorts and tank top, sitting out on the rock wall that bisected the dirt of the yard from the dirt of the driveway. Once, an old woman driving stopped. I don't know how old is old, maybe the old I am now, older than dirt, carved crevices around her mouth to tell me she once had a waist like mine, steep sloping down, though her ass sat up higher. I have been thinking about dirt, or maybe the rock along the road I never noticed I'd noticed growing up there, sandstone and shale striated with coal that always looked wet, even in summer, grass a paler brown than the dirt, which, depending on where in the county you were, might be a gravelly, sandy, stony, silty loam. Maybe she said buttocks. Probably she said butt. I didn't know what to say to her. I had nothing to say. On the road out of town, Kentucky 15 to the parkway, to the highway, an hour to there, and you're almost to Lexington, where there's something to do, not sit surrounded by kids and old and dirt, rough, broken, mountainous, deeply dissected. I didn't know that I knew how the farther you got up the road, the coal is gone. There's clay in the rock, and the grass is greener. I mean, really, it is on the other side. Thank you. So that's a little bit about that girl. And then I'll read the second poem from the book, which came when I went back to Jackson in southeastern Kentucky as a much older adult, just actually about 6 or 7 years ago, to do a series of writing workshops in the high school that I had gone to as a young girl. And this poem is called Home is the Place Where When You Have to Go There, You Only Think About How to Get Out. Busted up doll heads where the canned goods used to be, sun-steeped, hill-buckled sidewalks, and everybody just looks tired. Nobody cares this is where your mother used to buy her meat. The houses you lived in plowed under, moles scuttled through plumbing cracked with black dirt and roots. Nobody cares about your old woman body grown on the bones of the girl who walked these streets. Everybody has their own worn bones. Everybody remembers you, sort of. The newspaper man calls you by your mother's name. You can't remember the name of who you sat next to in math class, or whose back seat you crawled out of nights, the river fog so dense you came home hair and misplaced clothes all damp and smelling like mountain. Nobody cares, you know, this town by what is gone. Stench of grease spilled from the closed pool hall, mailbox on the corner where the boys sprawled, pelvises jutted out to block your path. You pull up your car too close to the high curb somebody told you was made for hitching horses. Nobody had any horses. So this book really does focus on Appalachia and on being a woman in Appalachia in as non-nostalgic way as I could get. But at the same time, as I was writing these poems in 2016, 17, that were very much sort of focusing inward and focusing on family and connection with place. I was also writing poems that were facing outward and looking at the state of the United States and of Appalachia, politically and socially and environmentally, during that period. And so those poems came out earlier this year, earlier in 2024. In a book called Will There Also Be Singing? And one of the things that I say about my work in general is that it really does kind of build on the idea that the personal is political, that speaking our lives as women or as disenfranchised people or anyone who would otherwise be silenced is in itself a political act. But with this book, really, the political gets very personal. That it's sort of an opposite focus. And so I'll read one poem from that, which really is focusing more on the United States as a whole, as opposed to Appalachia. But the book itself does go back into the region. This poem is called America. America, I am not singing you beautiful. I do not hear the melody beneath the roiling clang and clatter of your discord. I did not know I loved you, America, even broken as you were, until the fist came down. Don't it always seem to go you don't know what you thought you had until the dream of it is gone? Jolted awake, I sing your name, America, a stumbling, tired lament, a hum beneath my breath, in minor key, a lone note dirge, one word, please, quavering syllable to raise you up. I cannot sing you to your grave. This land is my only home, America, unsound in its frame. You are deaf now to our varied carols sung across your shorn mountains, above your withered plains. I am exiled, America, even as I walk your streets singing, Zion, we lay down and wept for thee.
There's so much emotion in that, and so many people can relate.
Yeah, it's unfortunately, I've actually said about this whole book that I wish it was not relevant anymore, but unfortunately, it still is, and it is again. But yeah, that poem was written in early in 2017, and it was it was probably one of the first poems where I was really able to uh, to use poetry to tap into my own emotion around what was happening, what is happening to the country, and I I'm glad it speaks to people as well. But I wish it didn't have to speak at all. I wish it was a historical document.
Well, in history, it tends to repeat itself sometimes. But in 300 years, Pauletta, when people do look at your work, what do you think that you would like to see as your legacy?
Oh my goodness. What a question, Becky.
I know.
Yeah, yeah. I think I think I am to a certain degree a writer of a place and time, but aren't we all? In a lot of ways that the only universal is through specifics, and so our ability to connect with people who write very specifically about their lives, 400 years ago or 500 years ago, is our own, is a way then to understand more about who we are as humans. And so I guess, if I can be part of that lineage in some way, if I could be part of helping people both see the ways in which people have lived in the past, but also learn more about, their own lives now, then I would be, I won't be there to be grateful, but I would be grateful to know that if there were a way of knowing that. But sort of mentioning the kind of historical piece, my and the connection with the past. My current project is actually um, looking back 400 years through the present to write in both prose and poetry a women's history of Appalachia by tracing my own maternal line. My 10th great, one of my 10th great grandmothers came to what was not yet America, not yet the United States, as what's called a tobacco bride. So she came to Jamestown in 1621 on a ship of other women who were to be married off to settlers in exchange for 150 pounds of tobacco leaves. And then eventually my family came into North Carolina, into the mountains of North Carolina, and then Southwest Virginia, and then through my grandmother into southeastern Kentucky, where my mother was raised and where I was raised. And so I'm tracing that family history, which was the genealogy was already given to me, but tracing contextually and finding what stories I can, and creating the stories that I can create to really think about and to write about and to think about how this country was formed and how the Appalachian region was developed, and my family's place in all of that.
I think that sounds so fascinating. Speaking personally, I was just in the Jamestown settlement in November, so that's just really
Wow.
cool. What would be the one piece of advice, Pauletta, that you would give to a writer today that has helped you?
So, I think, and I've, as I had told Becky earlier that I had a chance to listen to some of the other interviewees, and so I don't know that this is going to be anything new, but my my main advice is to recognize the role that community can play. That while we write alone to a certain degree, we can still be supported and developed, and to help develop and help support through a community of writers, and not just writers, of course, but I'm thinking particularly around writing. I mean, I was lucky enough to, as a very young writer in Appalachia, to kind of enter the field when there were a groupings of people who were very interested in helping to develop the voice of those writing within the region, because it was at a time when most of what had been written about Appalachia were written from those outside of Appalachia. And so there were older writers who were making sure that younger writers were getting the support that they needed to be able to tell our own stories. And so now I'm kind of on the other end of of my life. I'm part of that group supporting other writers as they come up into their voice. And here in Cincinnati, I'm also have been since the very beginning of my time here, have been lucky enough to be connected with a very rich and vibrant and generous group of writers, and then to help create and support that generosity as well. So, it's I think that the idea of recognizing that we're part of this lineage one way or another, and that other writers can be our lifeline, both to our words and to the world, is just really important.
Pauletta, it is my understanding that you were a writer in residence in Cincinnati. Tell us about that experience and what all were your responsibilities?
Sure. Yeah, I was writer in residence for the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library in 2022, which is a really cool program. There's not that many libraries within the United States that have writer in residence programs, and so we're lucky enough to have a program here that has been endowed. And I'm trying to think, I can't give you the exact number, but maybe the 10th person to have the job, something like that. Yeah, and then now there's been two or three people with coming to five after me, but it was a great position that I was able to do a number of programs, both live and online as well, because we're kind of coming out of the pandemic years during that time, that focused both on writers, but also on readers, on people who are just interested in learning more about the writing life, and young and work with kids, and just a number of folks, and then also was host of a podcast. So we were not we weren't like we didn't have the video like you do, but we did read or auditor aud but we did auditory recordings of interviews and conversations with other writers, which are still available on the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library's website. And actually, there are also links to those interviews on my website as well, for people who might be interested in checking in on them. And did a series of blog posts as well, quarterly blog posts of interest to readers and writers. So it
Well,
was
and
fun. It was a
speaking
great
of,
gig.
yeah, it sounds really cool. And speaking of your website, which I really encourage all of our listeners to check it out because it has got so many really neat resources on it. And one of the resources on it I really thought was so cool. It was called Draft to Craft. Can you tell us a
Mhm.
little bit about that?
Yeah, my work now, I mean, I've done a number of things in my life, from beginning as a Montessori teacher to I was a paralegal at the Legal Aid Society, and I've been director and co-director of various nonprofits, both artistic and otherwise. But for the last, gosh, almost 20 years now, what I mostly have done is just kind of hang up my shingle as a freelance writing teacher and work with people both in person in Cincinnati and now virtually on, via Zoom, who are interested in deepening their craft and having some opportunities to write and to get feedback from other writers, including myself. And so one of those programs that I started in about 12 years ago, when I was writer in residence at Thomas More University, is called From Draft to Craft. And it's a poetry class for poets, mostly almost, well, at Thomas More, it was, we're able to include sort of intergenerational work and to weave a few of the students in, but now it is entirely adults from all over the country and even beyond, who come together weekly in the spring and in the fall, and we write and read and give each other feedback. I do other programs as well, mostly through other organizations, but from Draft to Craft is my own. So it's no longer part of Thomas More University, and it is my own program that people just sign up through me. Also do women's retreats, which are in person, in Central Kentucky, quarterly. So it's very satisfying work, and I'm very, very grateful that I have the opportunity to do this.
Well, and you seem very creative, especially when you have created a book launch called Poems and Pints. Tell us
Right.
about that.
Well, my husband is a beer maker, and so we had actually done this pre-pandemic as well, to do a book launch that focused not just on my own book and the creative work, my creative work, but Owen's creative work as well with beer. So I had a party, book launch party in my backyard, and in the house, but mostly in the backyard, and invited two other poets, Katerina Stoikova, from who lives in Lexington, Kentucky, and Richard Haig, who lives here in Cincinnati, who had new books out. And we just had a book party, books and beer. Drinking wasn't, it wasn't mandatory, but for those who were interested in trying out Owen's beer, it was there and available. But it was nice to be able to get together in person again. This was the first book launch that I'd had in person since before the pandemic, even though I'd had a couple of books out in the meantime. And it was nice to be able to do it with other writers as well.
Well, one of the things that I do enjoy about your website is the fact that you do have so many resources available. I wanted to ask you though, for those writers who are new at websites, how did you launch yours and how do you maintain it?
So I'm lucky enough to have a beloved goddaughter who we trade work back and forth. And so she's too busy now, but at that point, we traded a class for her development of my website. But I maintain it myself, and it's not that hard. When you get right down to it, it's not rocket science. It's not even computer science, because there's so many programs now that are set up, for people to be able to do it yourself. And so mine is WordPress. There's Squarespace. There's other ones that work, and they all work fairly similarly. And so it's just a matter of, once, now that it's set up, that I know how to do to create new pages within it if I need to, but mostly it's a matter of adding and subtracting from what's already there.
Well, I think it's a wonderful website. I seriously encourage people to check it out. Um, Pauletta, you have such an extensive, wonderful career of helping others. And I just want to tell you, thank you so much for all you do for the literary world. And I wish you all the best in your writing future.
Thank you so much, Becky.